All right, and we're going to kick it off with our Dean, Lolita Buckner-Innes.
Thank you so very much. As you just heard, I'm Lolita Buckner-Innes. I am the newest dean of the University of Colorado Law School. I usually say the new dean. However, I've just completed my first year here, and it has been an amazing year in so many ways. I am so very pleased to welcome you all to the 2022 Ruth Wright Distinguished Lecture in Natural Resources, tonight featuring Fawn R. Sharp, who's the president of the National Congress of American Indians. As some of you know, this year marks the 8th annual Distinguished Lecture in Natural Resources. As was true with so many law school events, inside and outside the building, we were unable to conduct this lecture in person over the last few years because of the COVID-19 pandemic. While I'm sure we all recognize that there are still public health challenges out there, we are so grateful that some advances have been made and we were able to host you all back here at Colorado Law. This Distinguished Lecture Series is one of our school's signature events. It was designed to provide a public forum for thought leadership, allowing the speakers to reflect on their experiences, challenges facing natural resources, energy, and the environment. However, I would be remiss if I did not also say that this lecture is a place for idea cultivation as well. This is a place where the audience has the opportunity to consider existing frameworks, existing norms, and contemplate new ones. In 2018, the Getches-Wilkinson Center received a generous gift from the Wright Family Foundation to establish the Ruth Wright Distinguished Lecture in Natural Resources in honor of Ruth Wright's inspiring legacy as a leader in Western natural resources, land conservation, environmental policy, and advocacy. With this support, we look forward to bringing this free event to our community for years to come. Now, having said that, I know that you will all join me in thanking the Wright family and we are so pleased to have them with us tonight, Ruth and Ken and their daughter, Leslie Lacey. And again, thank you so much. I cannot say enough how much this means to the University of Colorado Law School, the community, and indeed well beyond. Thank you. I also want to thank the faculty and advisory committee, council of the Getches-Wilkinson Center for their commitment to making this one of the university's premier public policy institutions, and indeed, might I say, one of the nation's premier policy institutions. I want to give special thanks to our advisory council chair, Zach Miller, and vice chair Don Brown, who I believe have also joined us tonight. If you're out there, thank you so much. Now, last and far from least, I would like to thank former Colorado Law faculty member Carla Fredericks and the Christensen Fund for their generous support of this year's lecture. The Christensen Fund supports Indigenous peoples in advancing their inherent rights, dignity, and self-determination. We are so proud to convene people from a wide range of disciplines and backgrounds tonight to address some of the most compelling environmental issues of our times. And I once again now thank our distinguished lecturer, President Fawn Sharp, for joining us tonight and providing an Indigenous leadership perspective on how we mobilize not just our local community, not just state communities, but national and global communities on climate change. So on behalf of the University of Colorado Law School and the Getches-Wilkinson Center, as a unit of the Colorado Law School, I would like to thank you all for being here, and thank you those in the room, and thanks to any of you who are watching from around the nation and around the world. And with that, I will turn the podium over to Distinguished Professor Emeritus Charles Wilkinson. Thank you all. Thank you so much. I guess I'll go and shake your hand again. Thank you so much.
Good evening, and thank you for coming out on this beautiful Colorado autumn evening. Tonight, Fawn Sharp will be delivering the prestigious annual Ruth Wright Distinguished Lecture. Sharp, who has served as president of her tribe, the Quinalt Nation, for 5 terms, is now executive director of the National Congress of American Indians, the oldest and most and largest intertribal organization in the country. Fawn has become an expert in climate change and has written and helped put into law important advances at the tribal, state, national, and international level. Tonight, she will especially emphasize promising climate change development among Indigenous peoples worldwide. I wanted to mention Fawn, but Kristen Carpenter, my colleague, will be introducing her more formally. Where is Ruth? There we go. Ruth Wright is an authentic Colorado legend and hero, and one of the very most successful graduates in this law school's history. Current students will be inspired by Ruth. She was a student here in the early 70s when there were hardly any women in law schools. At that time, the number of women in virtually every law school was in single digits. That was true here. In her second year, she took an interest in land use law and wrote a seminar paper on the legality of local regulation of private property. That regulation was extremely controversial here and everywhere. Ruth argued that health limitations in Boulder were legally permissible. In her paper, she proposed the creation of a 55-foot height limit. This was a pivotal moment, with outside interests recognizing the economic potential of the magnificent Boulder Valley. The Boulder City Council had received dozens of applications for buildings of up to 10, 12, and 15 stories tall. The City Council clearly favored most or all of them. A group of citizens, led by Ruth and her colleagues and her paper, took the matter to the City Council. After a long and difficult struggle, the City Council did decide to adopt Ruth's 55-foot maximum. Combative lawsuits were filed, but the courts rejected them. The result quite quickly became noticed all across the country. Of course, now local governments have broad authority to recognize in land use planning the public interest as well as the private ownership. At the same time, with Ruth once again in the leadership, the city of Boulder adopted an unprecedented 1% sales tax, with the funds go to acquiring private undeveloped land to create open space. And look at what they have done. The 55-foot foot limit means that we can still see up to the mountains and be inspired by them from every place in town. And then we have this great open space around the city that makes Boulder such a distinctive place. Ruth has become known as the mother of the Greenbelt. That program, too, was nationally was admired nationally and was put to use by many local governments across the country. Ruth has been extraordinarily active on legislative and especially environmental matters ever since. She was elected to the Colorado House of Representatives in 1980 and served for 14 years. For 6 of those years, she was the minority leader of the House, only the second woman to hold that title. For years up until today, she has been an indispensable person in state policy, especially environmental affairs. Right now, it is well known that if you want to get sensitive and creative legislation passed, you have to have Ruth Wright behind you. Everybody knows what great judgment, influence, and wisdom that she has. Thank you so much from all of us, Ruth. And we're so glad that Ken and Leslie, your daughter, is able to join us also. Ruth, would you mind just to stand for a moment? Kristen, there you are.
Good evening. I'm Kristen Carpenter, Director of the American Indian Law Program here at the University of Colorado. I'd like to thank the Wright family, of course, as well as Dean Innes, Charles Wilkinson, Sean Labar, and Ellie Thurston, our American Indian Law Program Fellow, and all of our colleagues at the Getches-Wilkinson Center for extending the opportunity to the American Indian Law Program to co-sponsor this event. I was initially reluctant to take the mic, but now that Charles gave it to me, I am going to say a few words about our American Indian Law Program, which dates back to the 1970s when David Getches, and greetings, Anne, it's wonderful to see you, along with John Echo Hawk, who's also here, aided by a then young Charles Wilkinson and Rick Collins, all played a role in founding and staffing the Native American Rights Fund and pursuing its initial strategy around treaty rights, tribal natural resources and the environment, and reserved rights more generally. They, inspired by our Indigenous then students, now alums, Vine Deloria and Tom Fredericks, started teaching Indian law at the law school. And today we have an amazing program of tribal, federal, and international Indigenous peoples law, now including Professors Jim Anaya, Sarah Krakoff, Joan Policastri, Christina Stanton, and me teaching our students. We continue, fortunately, to work with NARF and tribes, and now our students are serving Indigenous peoples all over the world, from Belize to Thailand, thriving as leaders in National NALSA, and our students will come up at the end of the program, and pursuing just amazing careers, serving their own tribes in Indian country more broadly. Our guiding view in the American Indian Law Program is that Indigenous peoples deserve the very best lawyers, and we have an obligation to train them. This is a sacred mission that we take to heart and try to fulfill every single day. One of the best Indian lawyers in the country is tonight's speaker, National Congress of American Indians President Fawn Sharp. And before I get to her official bio, I'll tell a short personal story And it's one that I've actually never fessed up to Fawn, excuse me. The first time I met Fawn Sharp, she was running. It was 2002, and she was at the helm of a sovereignty run from her home on the Quinalt Indian Reservation to Washington, D.C. to protest judicial decisions eroding tribal sovereignty. And I didn't actually meet Fawn. She was already a semi-famous attorney at the Quinalt Indian Nation, and I was a very junior person in the Indian law community. And so I joined the pack on the last leg of the journey to the steps of the Supreme Court. And I didn't say anything or introduce myself. But I remember being in awe of this woman who could convince a whole country of lawyers, community members, and allies, 600 people, to get out of their offices, leave their homes, and follow her across the country, running as if their lives depended on it. And in fact, their lives did depend on it. What a woman, what a leader, and what a runner. I was happy just to jog behind. And here, 20 years later, I'm on stage now with President Sharp, who remarkably enough is running again across the country after some new and unfortunate decisions from the Supreme Court, this time with the energy not only of tribes and advocates across Indian country, but also the solidarity of Indigenous peoples from across the entire world, with whom President Sharp has met and worked over the last 20 years. Indigenous peoples who would drop everything and run with her for human rights, for justice, and for the earth. I've had the pleasure and honor to see President Sharp advocating at the United Nations, joining in and indeed leading the global Indigenous peoples movement around climate change. She reports powerfully and personally on the impacts of climate change for the Quinalt people. She meets with local, national, and global leaders to promote deeper understanding, deeper commitment, and true change. She's one of my heroes. Turning to the more official bio, and Charles mentioned a few of these points, Fawn Sharp is a 5-term president of the Quinalt Indian Nation. For anybody who knows tribal politics, you know that that's probably a miracle. And she now serves as president of the National Congress of American Indians. A leading voice in the global movement to address climate change, President Sharp has delivered presentations and published articles on this topic in venues throughout the United States and around the world. In 2021, President Sharp became the first Indigenous leader to be credentialed by the US State Department to attend the United Nations Climate Change Conference of the Parties, better known as COP26. And she regularly advises UN bodies on the human rights of Indigenous peoples. President Sharp's international advocacy is formed by her experience as a tribal leader, where environmental disasters in the Northwest especially have deeply affected Indigenous peoples' lands, resources, and people. President Sharp graduated with a Bachelor of Arts from Gonzaga University in Spokane at the age of 19 and received her Juris Doctorate from the University of Washington in 1995. She's been honored by the National Judicial College at the University of Nevada and the International Human Rights Law Program at Oxford. She is a lawyer, a mother, a weightlifter, and a runner who has stopped for just a short time to share her story with us. And with that, I give you NCAI President Fawn Sharp. Fawn?
Oh, Yohaj, Anjak, Hiwishka. Good evening, everybody. Chikhatsi. My name is Fawn Sharp, and I do serve as the president of the National Congress of American Indians, and I am so very grateful and honored to be here. Charles, thank you for the invitation, the friendship, the leadership, the advocacy, a lifetime of service to tribal nations. Kristen, thank you for that wonderful introduction and friendship, and I did not know that story. That's amazing that we were there on the steps of the Supreme Court, same time, 20 years ago. I left Cherokee Nation what is today? Today is Thursday, right? Or is it? Yes, it is Thursday. A week ago this last Tuesday, we launched the first Monday in October, the 20-year anniversary of the sovereignty run. And so I am just delighted. We knew we were going to do the run during this period of time, but the invitation, and I want to thank you, Ruth, just getting to know you just a brief moment upstairs. I'm so very honored to be part of this lecture and to join everyone this evening. I see John here. John has been a long time mentor of mine when I was a baby lawyer, and just the work that the Native American Rights Fund undertakes every single year. So having said that, when I arrived earlier, I had a bit of PTSD. I walked into the classroom and I felt like some of my assignment, I wondered if I had read my case notes and if I was prepared for a bit of dialogue with the teacher. And I told everybody that for years I had this dream that I passed the ethics part of the bar exam, but not the other part. And so I thought, I think I know I'm going to be an ethical lawyer. I just don't know if I'm going to be a good lawyer. So I'm just absolutely delighted. And one of my greatest joys in all the work I do is to interact with the students and future lawyers. I call them warrior lawyers. I played flag football when I was at the University of Washington, and our team was called the Warrior Lawyers. And so anytime I know that we have Native students who carry generations of teachings in their DNA, that we are preparing them for what I call a day of reckoning. We live in some pretty tough times right now. We live in a great deal of uncertainty. We live in a great deal of division and even to some extent apathy. But the world is in crisis. With the existential threat of climate change, the world is in crisis. With a global pandemic, the world is in crisis. With so much just hatred and vitriol and the info wars and the psychological warfare with the internet and social media and all those things that we know to be true, we are under a great deal of pressure at this particular time. And now more than ever, we need leadership, and we need young people to step up and to learn, and elders to teach and pass on that wisdom. And those of us who are in between to honor both. And so I feel like I'm at that stage in life where I'm somewhat of a storyteller because I'm almost an elder, but I'm also still connected as an advocate and as a tribal leader. And so in my remarks, you're going to see me kind of shift in and out of storyteller, lawyer, tribal leader, mom, but I'm very passionate about every role that I do have. I got elected as the nation's president back in 2006. I had never held political office in my life. In fact, I worked very hard to avoid politics. I did not think that was my future. I thought someday I would grow up and I would argue a treaty case in front of the United States Supreme Court, or maybe someday be a federal judge. I mean, those were the aspirations I had. And an elder talked to me about running to be tribal president. And our president retired. She was only the 8th president since the turn of the last century. So we had a great deal of longevity at the Quinalt Nation. And I told this elder, I've been trained to seek truth, justice, fairness, and politics, tribal politics. It just didn't quite jive with my perception of what I saw myself to be. And that elder pulled me aside, and I was happy to share this with some of the students earlier. He said, Fawn, you're not running to be a politician, you're running to be a leader. And a leader can bring those virtues to office, and that's what we need. And so with that, I undertook, and I basically surrendered mentally, physically, and spiritually to be called to answer a call to serve as a president. And so that first year of my tenure, I was directly confronted with the existential threat of climate change. And at that time in 2006, if you could imagine, there was a great deal of doubt. People, it was widely discussed that climate change is a farce, it's not real. And I remember having conversations in state meetings, even in regional meetings, national meetings. I would raise the subject of climate change. The room would get quiet, and then someone would change the subject. And I felt just, I felt I've got to go outside of this country if I'm going to have a dialogue. And so in 2008, I attended my very first conference of parties. It was COP14 in Poznan, Poland. And I thought at that time, I was waiting in 2008 during the presidential debate for a candidate who's running for the president of the United States to say the words climate change. It never came. If you go back and you look at the presidential debates at that time, it wasn't even a topic of debate. And as a young president who is directly confronting on the front lines the existential threat of climate change, I couldn't believe it. I could not believe that we were entering into another 4 years of a presidency, and the person that we are about to vote on didn't even say the words climate change. Now, why was that so important to me in 2008? For 2 years, I was talking with tribal elders who saw millions of sockeye return to the mighty Quinalt River in the 1950s and 60s. Millions, boatloads of salmon. The year I got elected, only 3,000 returned to the Quinalt. I learned about the ocean temperature warming, and I saw our scientists do an overlay of the spikes in the ocean temperature, and it was almost a perfect match with the years that we saw a decline. And I knew that while fisheries is a cyclic sort of industry, that it was a downward spiral and it was accelerating. I took a helicopter flight to look at our glacier, the Anderson Glacier that feeds the mighty Quinalt. And I cannot even begin to express in words the feeling when you're in a helicopter and you come over a ridge expecting to see a mighty glacier, and all you see is a murky pond of dirty water and not one shred of glacial sheen. And knowing that that glacier is so critically important to regulate the water flow, to regulate the water temperature. And it was non-existent. It was completely wiped out. And then I was called on to declare multiple states of emergency. December 1st, 2007, we had a fierce storm. They said it was the storm of a century. Trees fell down. Our coastline was threatened. The only access road on Highway 101 was starting to slide into the ocean due to sea level rise. We lost power for 8 days. We lost water. I had to try to figure out how to save and protect our elders who were on dialysis, who were trapped in some of our communities. And then later that year, I stood on our shores and I saw 2 miles of dead marine life just littering our coastline due to a lack of oxygen on the sea, on the ocean floor. And so you could imagine a young leader, two years into a presidency, never having held political office, directly confronting the threat of climate change, and there's not even a whisper of priority. There's not even a discussion of this issue. That is where I knew at that moment, every time I had a shred of hope that somebody might say the word climate change, that if we didn't take care of ourselves and defend ourselves and act aggressively, no one was going to do it. No one was going to harness the resources we need. No one was going to invest in the Upper Quinalt watershed to protect our salmon. No one was going to ensure that we were not only partners within the global community, but that we would own up to our part of the problem, our scale of responsibility. And I knew that as a young president, that I have a duty not only to protect my community, I have a duty to elevate the importance and the scale of the conflict and the responsibility of the United States of America within the global community to own it and to act on it and to come to the table with solutions. So with or without the state of Washington, with or without the United States, I felt it was important to engage with the global community on our vision for what we think we could do and rightfully should do as sovereign tribal nations and as members of the global Indigenous community, which is over 100 million Indigenous peoples around the world. We had to be there with or without the United States. And so that began. And so that seems sort of, how could someone with just 2 years of political life sort of think I had a place or a role or even an ability to do that? Well, there's another answer to that question. And I'm happy, Charles and I talked before the lecture, and we talked about the strength of tribal nations. I didn't come into this presidency trying to as one elected official trying to solve a problem. I came into this position knowing I stood on the shoulders of many tribal leaders that went before me at the Quinalt Nation. We had a major, just a pillage of our forests at the hands of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Just widespread, clear-cut logging all across the reservation. It just decimated our fisheries. It decimated our forests and those natural resources that our ancestors for centuries valued, treasured, and had a spiritual connection and a relationship with. Those natural resources that we use to carve our canoes, to make our baskets, all of those things that we held dear. And at the hands of our trustee, massive non-tribal logging entities just picked up tens of thousands of acres and pillaged our forests. But you know, the Quinalt Nation did not let that stand. We took the United States to task in a case called Mitchell versus US. And we held the United States accountable for that catastrophe and for that injustice. We also went to court in, and now here I'm going to get into my lawyer sort of hat, Squire versus Capelman, a tax case that really upheld our ability to raise revenues. And I could go on and on about various pieces of legislation. My president, Joe Delacruz, who was my predecessor, came up with this radical idea of self-governance. And formerly, we were under 638 contracts, which we would receive contracts with the federal government to administer funds. We didn't have a choice in how those funds would be spent, but every tribe received like this equal share of 638 contracts. Our president came up with the idea, what if we were to get the block grant based on our population, based on our need, and we decide how to spend that? So in other words, with $70,000, we don't take 70 students and give them $1,000. We look at how many students we have, we look at the need, and we fashion our governance based on our need and based on the value. That seemed to be a radical idea back then in those early years in the 80s. But guess what? With 5 other tribes, we successfully did that and started the self-governance demonstration project that later became permanent legislation. And now hundreds of tribes are able to make decisions. I remember my mom working as a secretary, she had to get permission to just buy a typewriter. That's how paternalistic it was. So to break away from that and introduce a radical idea like self-governance, to call on other tribes to take it to Congress and make it a project and then a permanent reality, was the legacy of leadership that I had inherited. The legacy of leadership that when we saw the United States just decimate our forests, there was a system of justice in which we could hold them to account. So you see, even though I was on the front lines of some of the most pressing issues that anyone has seen in our generation, and having the psychological impact, as well as feeling the pain and the angst of our tribal elders that could just see our disappearance. And I remember standing in front of our general counsel, and I said, we cannot be that last generation of Quinalts that see a blueback return, that has to explain to future generations what it tasted like, what it looked like, and the memory of all of our weddings, our graduations, our funerals, all of those things that are just intertwined with our identity. We cannot let that happen. And we have to aggressively do all that we can to restore our watershed. And so back then, we also knew this to be true. We knew that the impacts of climate change in 2007 were not even the beginning. We knew that these extreme weather events would become more frequent. We knew they would become more intense. And the reality that we are witnessing now, when a mega fire is not an event that happens once a decade, but it happens every single year, when hurricanes and tornadoes just rip communities apart, this is that reality that we knew back then that was on the horizon. And so how did we, the Quinalt Nation, do and respond in a concrete way that made a difference? In my mind, it was very clear. We had one path and one path only, and that was to go directly after those who are responsible for this and hold them accountable. It wasn't going to be enough to try to lobby Congress for additional funding. We barely get resources, not even a baseline to provide basic healthcare and education and law enforcement. There's no way the public treasury is near the scale to address the climate crisis. We have to hold those who are directly responsible, big oil industry, who for decades have used and exploited our resources. And we have to price carbon to secure the resources, to reinvest in our vision, in our way of trying to restore all that's been lost and all that we stand to lose into the future. And so I worked directly with the state of Washington, with Congress, and it was clear that there's just no political will in this country. And I remember after Obama was elected, he addressed the global community in Bonn, Germany, to announce there is no political will in the United States. And even when we look at something like the Inflation Reduction Act, that is not even come close to a down payment on what we need. And so we have to go after industry. So Quinalt and a group of tribes in the state of Washington co-led a citizen campaign to price carbon. It would have been the very first carbon pricing legislation in the country. And the fossil fuel industry, the Western States Petroleum Association, spent $33 million to kill our initiative. They came in, out-of-state oil interests came into our state to kill our vision of what we thought was necessary minimally to secure the resources. And it was a bargain basement. It was $50 a metric ton. And they still came into Washington and killed it. We came back with a vengeance. And we were able to price carbon in the Climate Commitment Act. And what does that mean? It means 10% of all carbon revenues for tribal nations. It means the resources to move our villages to higher ground. 2 of our villages right now are ready to fall into the ocean. In fact, the highway, if you drive through Quinalt, the trees are almost horizontal and the cliff is giving away. And that's our only entry into our home community of Taholah. And so with all of these different activities and things happening, we now have 10% of all carbon revenues that go into at least a good decade or more that we, the budget scoring for that. We also wanted to ensure we had a seat at the table. And as Christian said, we had that same year, and this was just a year ago in 2021, we passed legislation to hold industry accountable, and we secured a seat at the table. So after 15 or 16 years of heavy lobbying and knowing that nobody else was going to be there to defend our interests, we stepped up with other tribes. We formed a coalition with the Seattle environmental community, and we held industry accountable in the state of Washington, and we now have those resources. So of all of that work, it became clear to me as well that it's not enough to just do that here in the United States. We know that there's a responsibility that we have to the 100 million Indigenous peoples around the world. And when you think about, in this moment, there are Indigenous peoples who are risking life and death to just stand up for what's right. Life and death in the Amazon and the lungs of the planet. They are risking every single day life and death. And it's one of those challenges where I know we're not in this position and in this role as lawyers. We're not in this position or this role as policymakers. We are citizens of a larger community and a larger generation. And as I said, this is a moment and day of reckoning. There's no way we're going to regulate our way out of this crisis. There's no way we're going to buy our way out of this crisis. The only way we are going to get out of this crisis is to return to the ways that our ancestors taught us. That is the only way. If you think about the trajectory that we are on right now in this country, it has an end. It cannot be sustainable. When you think about the continued oil extraction, and you can think about the continued, just the everything being driven from a short-sighted, narrow, individual, money-driven interest. It is impossible to overcome multi-generational challenges when there's so much division and so much short-sightedness. But I know that with the values and the partnerships and the friendships that tribal nations have been able to cultivate over a wide range of issues, that the average citizen in this country, the average person that has any connection with community, knows that the fate and the future of our planet depends on us rising above all of the conflicts and coming together in a unified way. That is the only way that we are going to get out of this crisis, and to follow those basic principles that we have been taught for generations. And when we had a chance to address the global community last year at COP in Scotland, we stood with John Kerry and Deb Haaland, Secretary of Interior, and we had Indigenous leaders from every part of the planet at the table. And if you could imagine representatives of over 100 million people sitting down directly with the United States. For some of those advocates who've spent a lifetime trying to get just one meeting with the US and never succeeding, you could imagine what that room was like. For some of those elders from Kenya, those elders from the Philippines, those elders from Ecuador. And when we were able to enter into bilateral and multilateral conversations about our issues at home, it didn't matter the borders. It didn't matter that we were from different parts of the planet. Every Indigenous person in that room, and we had elders and we had young people in that room, it was universal. And we all could feel each other's pain, but we also could feel our strength. And my message to the global community during that period of time when we were in Scotland was, we have to realize that we are not weak and vulnerable. We may be on the front lines of climate change. We may be disproportionately impacted by climate change. We may not have the resources to protect our communities, but we are far from vulnerable and we are far from weak. Because when you look at the timeless teachings of our ancestors and the timeless fights that we have had to protect the natural world, and doing more and more with less and less, tribal nations stand far above, and we're able to produce and deliver results that no other governing body can. And so when we gathered with all of those Indigenous leaders around the world with the United States, you could see a major shift in the work. And it was a far cry from the first time I had attended COP. The very first time I attended, I went to the State Department, and the person that was at the door said there was another Indian here, an hour ago. Can't all of you Indians get together and just send one person? And that was the response I had. So you could imagine when I was in Scotland and I went to that same door and I knocked on that door, and the person who opened that door was Deb Haaland. It was a different conversation. And after 15 long years of fighting this struggle, feeling like there were moments where I didn't know if my community was going to survive, if our elders, if our planet, if humanity was going to survive, our salmon, our trees, all those things that we hold dear. And to know that we are at a place and a time where we have the right people, where we have the right mindset, and regardless of politics, regardless of the money and the greed, regardless of all of those things that have held us back, there is something that is larger than any one individual, that's larger than our generation, and it is that inheritance and that calling. And with the Indigenous peoples around the world, we all have that same story and that same calling and that same sense of obedience and duty to bring back the natural law and order. Man-made law has failed us. Man-made politics has failed us. Man-made economic systems of greed and individualism has failed us. But what we know to be true is that when we do surrender mentally, physically, and spiritually to be good stewards as we are taught, that is a timeless and proven through centuries course of action. And I'm waiting for that moment and that day and that time and hour when things like the economic system in this country, and it's starting to happen, begins to recognize the intangible value of clean water. When they begin to understand and value an ability just to breathe. I remember some of the staunchest opponents I had in the climate fight in the state of Washington and Eastern Washington seemed to come to their senses when we had a mega fire in Eastern Washington and their kids couldn't go outside and play and they had to stay in their homes for days. They started to get the message. And we're at the beginning, as I said, of this crisis, and it's on a trajectory that is not good for anyone. But as we see the impacts intensify, the weather events become more frequent and more intense, when we see food sovereignty become a reality and food insecurity become a reality, when we see military conflict intensify and become a reality over those precious few resources as they dwindle and dwindle and dwindle to nothing, and we have nothing left. And there are parts of this country where they don't have clean water. I just came from an area in the Southwest in New Mexico where they have to pack water. In the Navajo Nation where there's still uranium, and they've seen studies of women who are pregnant and their fetus has uranium impacts. Those things are very real, and there's an effort to deny that. And there's an effort, but we know those things to be true. But in that moment, in that hour, when that trajectory gets to a point where everyone is searching for solutions, we are going to be there. And we are going to be standing on generations of teachings and generations of solutions and honoring our ancestors and looking out for 7 generations as we have since time immemorial. That is the rightful place where our next generations of advocates and lawyers, our next generations of leaders, our next generation of parents and grandparents, that's the reality of what we are facing. And as stark and dimming as that may seem, it's our greatest opportunity. And I've come to go through the ups and downs of fighting this climate crisis. And I shared just briefly with those upstairs what I've experienced on this sovereignty run and what I've experienced over the last probably 3 years. And I'm going to give you just 3 examples of what I'm talking about to put it into perspective. When we launched the sovereignty run at Cherokee Nation, and I shared this with the class as well, the elders sang Amazing Grace in Cherokee, in the Cherokee language. And right behind them, the morning sun started to shine brightly through the trees. And as they sang the song, it got brighter and brighter and brighter. And I shared that video just a few minutes ago. We got into Cheyenne and Arapaho with our totem, and we were surrounded by 800 head of buffalo that started to run around us. As my hand was on the totem pole in prayer, I could hear them. I could feel them breathing on me that close. And it was powerful. At first, it was a bit intimidating when you see a whole herd start to circle around you and start to run. But in prayer, I felt the strength of our ancestors and our relations. And my mentor, Billy Frank, taught us that the salmon can't get out of the river. The buffalo can't get out of the range. We have to be their voice. And so I felt in my prayer that the power of those buffalo were right there with us to remind us, speak for us and speak on our behalf. And then just 2 days ago, we were at Acoma and looking over Sky City with our totem, and it was 70-some degrees. And we got out, there was just a gust of wind. It started to rain on us, and which was unusual. We didn't know it was, but it just rained right on us. And then the sky opened up and there was a massive rainbow that just came out over Sky City. And on the totem, it's a chief's totem, and the chief has a carved mask, and it's a raven mask. And a raven was perched up and flew right over the totem into the rainbow. Now, I mean, when you think about all of those things in that one moment, we arrived at this sacred site, we get out, there's a gust of wind, there's some rain, there's a rainbow, and there's a raven. That's what I'm talking about. The role and the work and those things that we do in our profession, it has to be grounded in something. And for the indigenous peoples of not only here in the United States, but the indigenous peoples around the world, we have generations of songs, generations of prayer and ceremony across this entire country. Long before 400 years ago, centuries ago. And every one of those prayers, every one of those songs, every one of those ceremonies were for the health of the planet and the relationship that we have with each other, with all things living, and with our Creator. And I talked to some of the students earlier, and I said, there is a reason why there was such an aggressive effort to stop us from speaking our language. There was an aggressive effort to stop us from doing our songs and our ceremonies. They knew the power that brought to Native people. And they knew that if Native people were to be taken over and conquered, they had to take out the Indian and save the man. But fortunately, that has never left us. There is not a single thing that a Congress, a court, any system, any political system, any economic system can separate us from that. It's in our DNA. My great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, 6 generations back, was Chief Tendoy. And Chief Tendoy was someone who was a peace broker. And so when I think about what is in my DNA and those that went before me that fought to broker peace, our value system is the same. And I saw that when I was in Scotland meeting with some young people, and they had asked me to stop by, and there were young people that were Indigenous that were speaking in Russian through an interpreter. They were speaking in Spanish. They were speaking in Filipino, but we shared a talking stick. And as each one of those young people talked, we could all relate. We could all feel the power in their message. We could all feel the pain in their uncertainty, fear, and doubt about the future. It was a shared sense of duty and responsibility. And it was so incredibly powerful. And I also, on this run, had mentioned Jim Thorpe is another person that we are honoring with the Sovereignty Run. And Jim Thorpe, as many of you know, won several gold medals that were taken away. And yesterday, as a Navajo elder was praying when we were in Gallup, I saw the poster that we have of Jim Thorpe, and he was recognized as the greatest athlete to ever live. And during that prayer, it just came to me that behind Jim Thorpe are centuries of ancestors and his strength and that which is in his DNA. It was so incredibly powerful for the entire world to see. And I thought to myself in that moment, as that elder was praying, the future generations that we see on the horizon, they are going to come. And I'm encouraging tribal leaders to think about, we are not only the descendants of our ancestors, we are the ancestors of our descendants. And so we have that duty, not only to do the work for us to just basically survive and basically fight to live on this planet, but we have to acknowledge that every single day that we get up, we have to think about those 7 generations, because we will be those ancestors. And it is so important for us in this moment and in this hour, in this time, to do our very best as human beings. Resist the temptation to be apathetic. Resist the temptation to engage in divisive politics. There are so many temptations and distractions. And I often think about the scale of the crisis that we're up against. The distractions, we've never seen more intense and more aggressive. But I found there's leaders in every sector. You'll find leaders in the faith-based community. You'll find leaders among young people. You'll find leaders in the scientific community, among lawyers, among politicians. But when we can rise above that to come together, that's what we have to do as human beings and to confront these challenges within the global community. So the last thing I want to say is, when I was in Scotland and I had to address and represent North America, it was not only the 570 sovereign tribal nations in the United States, but over 600 in Canada. So between Canada and the United States, it was 1,000 sovereign tribal nations. And I saw an elder sitting in the front, toward the front. And that elder talked to me afterwards, after the remarks, and had talked about what was happening in Vancouver Island. And we had a common story that we shared. And I thought, no matter the time and the distance between our sovereign tribal nations, that these stories are alive, and we may have relinquished millions of acres through treaty, but we've never relinquished our spiritual connection to those lands. Before the introduction of the almighty dollar, we were rich and wealthy, and we had very sophisticated systems of trade and commerce. And we had thriving social fabric. And that elder reminded me of something, a lesson that I learned in my first term. I was called on to talk about a myth and a truth with Native Americans. And of course, I thought about all the stereotypical myths, but I thought one myth was, upon European contact, we were primitive. I mean, there's this thought that when Europeans came, we were primitive. Well, when you think about mature societies, whether it's Abraham Maslow or writings of Stephen Covey, they talk about maturity being a triangle. And at the bottom, you have very selfish people. And then at the next level, you have independent people. And then at the very top, you have interdependent people. And that's a mature society. Well, Native Americans had an interdependent relationship, not only with fellow humanity, but with animals, with the forest, with our creator. So contrary to the belief that upon European contact we were primitive, we were actually very mature. We were not primitive. We had a healthy relationship that was a society built on thinking about future generations, about respecting and having ceremony for our animals when we received a salmon from the river, for prayers that have been timeless. And as I said, for generations, those prayers continue to echo. So anytime you go into any part of this country, you are going to find that we are walking in the footsteps of our ancestors, no matter where you go here in the United States. And you're going to find that this country has been blessed with centuries of prayer and ceremony. And it's no wonder why, with a relatively young country, we become arguably the most powerful country in the world. And that is because there is a foundation here that is timeless, that is sacred, and that is eternal. And so when we think about the role that we have with a global community, it is not only advocating our interests, but a country that is unhinged from its basic foundation of truth, of justice, and of equity. But it's that part of our our next generation that's growing into it and learning. And so I just wanted to say and make that point that people often think that upon European contact, we were primitive. We were far from it. And it's that foundation that has never been lost, even though arguably the most powerful country on the planet tried to assimilate us, try to terminate us, wiped out millions of our ancestors. That remains, and it is unbroken. And every bit of those songs and prayers are not only for our benefit, but the benefit of every citizen of this country. And as we advocate our interests within the global community, we know that it's not only for our people in 7 generations, but a country that still needs to step up and own its responsibility, a country that still needs to come to terms with that dark chapter and that dark history. But this is a moment and a day of reckoning, and it is here right now. And you could turn on the news, you could see symptoms of all of the social conflict, of the political conflict. You could see direct conflict. And this is not how we want to raise our children and our grandchildren. But I'm just so very confident that in this time and in this hour with this generation, we are not only going to meet these challenges, but we will emerge stronger, because that is our inheritance and that is our legacy, and there's no getting around it. And so in closing, I just want to say, I can't even, it's hard for me to articulate in words the power and the meaning of our role in the global community, because as I said with the carbon pricing mechanism that we did, that was all policy. And the world economy is now beginning to respond to the climate crisis. And there's trillions of dollars that are going to be deployed all across this planet to fight the climate crisis. And we're seeing that here in the United States with the Inflation Reduction Act. And how is that going to be spent? And just like we were able to lead carbon pricing measures in the state of Washington and hold industry accountable, that same political influence is dragging the US economy in a transition from fossil fuel to renewable energy. That same influence is dragging and holding us back as a country from owning our part in this crisis. And there are those around the world and outside the United States that truly understand and appreciate Indigenous peoples are on the front lines, and that we're disproportionately impacted, and that we have little to no resources. And they're wanting to render and deploy that. But we have NGOs and we have others that use our images, that accept funding, and that oftentimes act against our interests. And so one of the things that we are working on is drawing that investment to deploy to Indian country and to deploy to Indigenous peoples. And when we were looking at cap and trade back in 2007, the domestic market was trading at $2 to $3 a metric ton. The international market was trading at $32 a metric ton. And domestic companies couldn't access those markets because the US was not a signatory to the Kyoto Protocol, but a tribal nation could. And so that's an example in a way that based on our sovereign powers and standing, we could enter the international economy and bring an economy that's nature-based, where there is a value to an intangible, like clean water. There's a value to that. And so the next chapter that we see in the climate agenda that we are advancing globally is not only policy, but an economy that is based on keeping things in the ground, based on having clean water, and all of those values that we see. So I recognize that the standing that we have, that all of us have in this country, and the sovereign tribal nations here in the United States, where we have a bilateral and multilateral relationship with the US, are going to be able to bring the global community together and continue to demonstrate the type of leadership that we did in the state of Washington. So we are, again, with or without the United States, the Indigenous peoples of this country and the Indigenous peoples of the world understand the sacred nature of our standing and where we're at this moment in time. And we are coming together to ensure that we can enlist the resources and the help and the alliances that are necessary. So I just, again, I am so humbled and honored to be here. I feel like I've been talking a very long time over law, politics, international law, tribal law, storytelling, how I got into this. I thought it was just very important to introduce myself and my role as a president and the challenges. And I hope I was able to convey the magnitude of the challenge, how the David and Goliath, if you will, of a young president, being able to take on the fossil fuel industry, and then being able to translate that to global policy and action, while understanding and recognizing we are not alone. We have inherited so much from our ancestors, and with that inheritance comes duty and responsibility, and there is a way out. And we see that way out for all of us. So I am just so very honored and grateful to be here. And I literally am going to have to run, but I'm just, again, so honored and privileged. And I just, in closing, want to thank the students and Kristen. The discussion we had earlier was by far one of the most inspiring engagements I've had in a very long time. And there's some excellent students here. And I just want to be a resource to anyone and everyone who's willing to join us in this fight. So thank you so much. I appreciate every one of you. Thank you. Thank you. Is that the right time? Is it like 7:15?
I think we let the beauty of those remarks stand alone and not sully them with questions. So with that, I'll invite Kristen and the Native American law student to come up here for a brief presentation.
Did we start at 6? A little after 6:30? Did I?
Is my microphone on? Great. Well, thank you, President Sharp. That was absolutely amazing. And you've, I think, inspired every single one of us in this room to take personal responsibility and action. And again, we would follow you anywhere, but you've given us a path, I think, and that means a tremendous amount. Yeah. We, both the American Indian Law Program and the Native American Law students want to honor you with a blanket. Oh, that's beautiful. And maybe we'll switch spots so you all can go closer to President Sharp.
Thank you.
For those of you who don't know, in a lot of our Indigenous communities, it's a traditional honor and blessing and gift to wrap somebody in a blanket who has been
Thank you.
a leader. You all are doing a horrible job. Dear God. Okay, so hold on. That's what. Oh God. We don't want to. Okay. There we go. Okay.
I'm in a group hug.
Okay. And I guess I want to say that it's so, important for us in the intergenerational sense to honor those who are, I guess in reservation dogs, they're calling them young elders. I think you're sort of a young elder, but truly we are blessed, honored by your presence. And I, at the same time, do want to acknowledge our students. Many of my American Indian Law and Advanced Indian Law students are here. And in particular, just to give some acknowledgement to our NALSA leadership. So from President Sharp's right, we have Kelby Welsh, who's a citizen of Cherokee Nation. And I think Kelby and I were both glad to hear the sovereignty run started there. And then a few people over. Josh Bertolotto is a citizen of the Tunica Biloxi Indian tribe and is vice president of NALSA. To my right is Milo Salazar, who is of Mexican indigenous descent and who is the secretary of NALSA. And then to President Sharp's left is Sienna Kalina, who's a citizen of the Osage Nation and is treasurer, but she's also president of National NALSA. And actually, among the four of them, we basically have Colorado NALSA and National NALSA represented. So these students are showing incredible leadership. And I think just of the kind that President Sharp has discussed, there are hope for the next generation. So thank you very much all.